forward to your questions and how you might be able to apply what I'm going to talk about, maybe to the cases where you're particularly interested in yourself. So this is a presentation without any data. It is only conceptual, and I hope to give you like a framework where you can then put in the meat to the bone by yourself. So I have the slides here. Hopefully they can be seen now. So it's a paper on sludge and transaction costs. And to begin with, of course, the question is, what is sludge? It sounds a bit dirty. So in order to explain what sludge is, I will be a bit broader to begin with and talk about its cousin. And its cousin is something that I guess people are more familiar with, and that is nudge. So the reason we talk about sludge is, I believe, because it rhymes with nudge. And that's why the authors of the book Nudge now are working on sludge as well. So Nudge is a book that came out in 2008, so quite a long time ago. And Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize winner, and Cass Sunstein, he was one of the most proficient social scientists we have these days. He won the law equivalent of the Nobel Prize as well, 2 years ago now. And they wrote this book, which has been a massive success, and everywhere in the world, governments and industry and individuals engage in nudging now. So it is really, they are working on a nudge 2.0 these days as well. And they said that there will even be a chapter on sludge in nudge 2.0, which then might come out at one stage. Anyways, this is the book. It was really successful. And here are a couple of examples of what nudges are. Here's the quite famous choice cafeteria, and that is where Apu tries to nudge Homer to eat a bit more healthily. And as you can see, Homer has the choice between fruit and veg or between donuts. And so the choice is his. He can do whatever he wants to do, but it feels a bit easier to take the fruit, partially because it grabs more attention. It's just in front of him, and partially because he doesn't have to go to the back of the cafeteria in order to open the door and get to the donuts. So it's a tiny, really, really tiny extra costs to get the donuts. And that's what Sunstein and Thaler call a change of the choice architecture that then leads us to change our behavior a little bit. Thaler sometimes called it as well one-click paternalism. So it is paternalistic because Homer is trying to get Homer eating healthy, so something that is generally a good thing. But Homer, there is a tiny cost on Homer, but that cost is really just a one click in the online context, or here just a few steps to open the door to the fridge to get to the donuts. So that's what nudging is. It's often a change in the choice architecture. So we talk a lot about choice architecture in this presentation as well. Here's another example. That's the different type of choice architecture on your printer. There might be a default. You might print one-sided or double-sided. If you just change that printer, the amount of paper that you use will be quite different afterwards. And that is even true for organizations that are very environmentally friendly. When in these organizations you change from one-sided printing to double-sided printing, printing costs reduce quite a bit. Even everybody is motivated to act environmentally friendly. On the right side, you see one of the most popular studies here on organ donation. It's now data from 2003, but it also shows the importance of the choice architecture in the sense of the default setting here. So Germany, where I'm from, had in 2003 a share of organ donors of 12%, and Austria, just next to it, where people are not very different, a little bit different, but not very different, they had a share of organ donors of 100%. And the only difference was that in Germany it was opt-in, so I had to carry a little card with me to indicate that I'm an organ donor. And in Austria, you're automatically an organ donor and have to opt out, and it seems nobody opted out there. So something that is supposedly irrelevant, shouldn't matter too much in the grand scheme of things, matters a lot, like defaults. Another very important area of the choice architecture, social norm interventions. So if you get in your energy bill at the end of the quarter or end of the month, if you get a comparison with your efficient neighbors and all neighbors, and maybe a little smiley there as well, well, then you're quite likely to change your behavior as well, just a couple of percentage points, but this has been shown to be an effective nudge, and there's another social norm intervention. So if you can think of if the city of Dublin runs a campaign, so many people litter in Phoenix Park, we need to stop this. Well, that suggests that the normal thing to do is littering in Phoenix Park. So the social norm is to litter in Phoenix Park. So that would backfire. So the literature suggests that you should communicate what most people do. So take your litter home, other people do as well, and everybody, or many people, want to be like other people as well. And finally, a different form of choice architecture here in the recycling context. So these are pictures I took of some recycling bins that don't make it easy at all to recycle. So if you just walk by and have to throw something away quickly, does it go into mixed recycling or general waste? Well, you don't know by only looking at this. So this is really horrible choice architecture with good recycling signage, like the one on the red side. On the right side, you immediately see that's easier. So really tiny changes, these nudge, and they don't cost much, these changes. And that was partially the reason why people really liked nudges and why they were so popular in many governments these days. So here's from a map from 2018. In Ireland, we have the central bank, the ESRI, the Irish tax, SEI, and the EPA. That was me being funded with them as well, who have some behavioral insights teams in public policy all over the world. Right now, there are many more. So this is from 2018, and this list is growing. Faisal Naru from the OECD is working on the next list as well. So it's really something that's happening all over the world, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And we do our best at the Behavior Science and Policy Group at Geary to do this for Ireland as well. Now, this is the book that Thaler and Sunstein wanted to write, with the title Libertarian Paternalism. So, and they didn't write this book at the end. Some editor told them maybe call it slightly differently, call it a nudge. And that most likely was really a good idea not to call this book Libertarian Paternalism. It would not have been the international bestseller with the title Libertarian Paternalism, most likely. But I wanted to mention this because libertarian paternalistic nudges are really what people talked about at the very beginning. So some people argue that all nudges are libertarian paternalistic, which means they are freedom preserving. That is the libertarian aspect of it. And today we talk more about the paternalistic aspect of them. So the nudges are often used to make choosers better off, as judged by themselves. So nudges that should get you to eat healthier or save more for retirement, or basically make people better off. So this would be the paternalistic element of nudges. And at the beginning, when we talked about nudging, we always talked about these positive nudges, these nudges that are ethical, not nudging for good. In fact, that was quite important also at the beginning, because when Thaler, this is one of the co-authors of the book Nudge, when he signed the book Nudge, he always signed with the saying nudge for good in the book. So what this shows us that he really knew that nudging can be used for either, and that there can be ways of using behavioral insights, changes of the choice architecture to make more profits for firms, for example, or to make access to benefits more difficult, or other more or less evil things. So behavioral science can be used for bad as well. So he said in this interview in 2015, unfortunately, that is meant as a plea, not as an expectation. So he always expected that there will be some nudging for evil. And that's exactly what we talked today about. So I just gave you the introduction of what nudging is and what choice architecture is, and that it's generally thought of as a libertarian paternalistic way of doing it. But these days, more and more people get interested in the dark side of behavioral science. And that is exactly what we talk about today. How can behavioral insights, aspects of the choice architecture, and so on, be used for evil? And one way to use them for evil will be sludging. So here's the Twitter, it's the Twitter description that Thaler put out. The last sentence is, I strive and seek to destroy sludge. So he's really putting forward that he's going from trying to nudge people to do better things, to try to avoid sludge in society. And Sunstein is writing another book on sludge as well. And here you have the first idea what sludge could be. Paperwork, waiting periods, licenses, permits, and paperwork. So that's a good idea already of what sludges are. And I'll give you many more examples there in the beginning. So we are now in the dark side. So before the examples, here's a definition of what sludge is, and that's the definition that Sunstein gave last year. So he called sludge as excessive or unjustified friction that makes it harder for people to do what they wish. So there's a friction like that is reducing how easy choices are for you. So sludge impedes decision making by making it more difficult for people to navigate through life. So if you want to achieve something, for example, you want to apply for a new job, there will be a lot of paperwork. Or if you want to apply for a research grant, there will be paperwork. Or if you want to apply or cancel a subscription of a newspaper, there will be a lot of hurdles in the beginning. So these are really the frictions that Sludge is talking about. And most likely when you think about your own life, when's the last time that you were really annoyed with something? Most likely it was this type of a friction. So something where you thought this should be easy, but it is really difficult to do it. So if you think of in your everyday life, there might have been something where you'd say, oh, that's sludgy. And now you have a language to talk about this. And that's one of the benefits of this type of research, that we get a language for these everyday annoying things that slow us down and don't allow us to do what we want to do, or at least make it more difficult. Now here are tons of examples. It starts with hidden subscriptions. Now you will get so many emails that you don't really want to get, maybe because there was a default already clicked. So that is a sludge, because it makes it more difficult to get what you want, which is freedom from hidden subscriptions. Or have you ever tried to cancel your Amazon Prime membership? If you have Amazon Prime, for example, try to cancel this. It will take you a long time. What you have to do is you have to go to YouTube and watch a video, and then they will guide you through where you have to go. But this changes from time to time. So a very, very sludgy process that is a friction in the system, makes it much more difficult. There are so many complicated forms in interactions with the government, but also in contracts with firms. Fine print is long and confusing. These are all frictions that make it more difficult to get where we want to go to. For example, moon pricing, that is this idea of having a TV announced for 2,000 euros, but that then only costs 399 euros in the shop. So there's a moon price or a false discount claim that makes it more difficult to evaluate the actual price of the TV. Websites can be temporarily offline, you know, they are there, but you have to try another time, which is then less convenient for you. So that is maybe at least a borderline nudge. Inconvenient return policies. So I have loads of things here where I ordered 2 pairs, well, not too many, but sometimes I would order, say, 2 pairs of shoes, and I know, okay, one is smaller, the other is bigger, and I send the one back that doesn't fit, and then I forget to send it back. You know, it's just annoying things. Unfavorable default settings that can then lead to hidden transcriptions. There's pressure selling, this idea that you have on booking.com, where they tell you only 2 rooms are left. And there you have some psychological friction. You think, oh no, I really have to do it. Going away now would be costly. So there are some psychological costs as well. There are the default settings as well. And then sometimes you want to, for example, I wanted to get health insurance here in Ireland, and it was a mess. I had no idea how, it's not my language, and then all the medical terms. And then there were so many options. So it was almost impossible to find the right health insurance for me. It was like a confusopoli, too many options. All of these things are frictions. All of these things lead us to achieve, or make it more difficult to achieve what we want to achieve. And there are lovely websites here as well that you can Google and have a look at. A few more examples that I just found recently on Twitter. This is one in the gambling industry, and this is from Gamble Aware. And if you read this and only look for a second at the screen, what you see is fun. You see, gambling is fun. Well, that's great. But of course, the message is when the fun stops, then stop. And then colleagues, especially Philip Newell, who is now in Queensland in in Australia, who was a colleague as well in Stirling when I worked there. He did research on this, showing that this is not reducing gambling. You know, people associate gambling with fun if gambleware and these companies do these things. Here's another one. It took me about 3 tries to completely turn off Google location tracking. I kept thinking I had turned it completely off and it would just pop back up. So if I cannot manage this, and this is a technologically savvy person, and he couldn't turn off Google tracking. So that's another good example. Here's a study that came out by about 2 weeks ago, I think, by Mark Pettigrew and colleagues from London. And they looked into the alcohol industry. So the industry like Drink Aware, who talk about, provide information about alcohol, but are sponsored by the alcohol industry. And they would make it really easy to see this alcohol is great. And then it's very difficult to identify that it is harmful. For example, on some websites, you would have to go through a lot of unnecessary information that is not really important to then at the end up with the health consequences, the harmful health consequences of alcohol. So they made it relatively difficult to identify these negative health consequences. So that would be sludge as well. And then here's one from today. So there seems to be a vote going on in the US, and in Florida, there's a voter registration. And it seems to be the case that the deadline was, don't know if it's today, there's the time difference, but the website is not temporarily down. So, and that was mentioned that this could be weaponized sludge, you know, using sludge in the voting area. But you can see that there's some sludge in the public sector and in the private sector as well. So a lot of this sludge is going on. Okay, that's the background. That's what we're talking about. And as you saw now, sludge is, the definition was about excessive frictions and creating some tiny extra costs that then make it more difficult to achieve some things. And I talked with my colleague Sina Shahab about this, who was here in UCD and then moved a year ago to Cardiff. And then we talked about this and we thought, Sina is an expert on transaction costs. And he said, well, isn't this very similar to transaction costs? Sludge essentially describes that you make some things that you want to do a little bit more difficult, as if you add an extra cost. And we have a literature on 50 years more or less on transaction cost economics. Maybe we are reinventing the wheel. And then I said, no, it's totally different. And then, but how is it different? And that's how we got to start to think about this project on sludge and transaction costs. What are the differences? And are there differences at all? And if there are differences, can one literature learn from the other literature? And what we are doing in this paper, we try to identify where the literature on sludge can learn from the 40 years or 50 years of transaction costs economics. Okay, so transaction costs is something that most economists learn in their, at least in their postgrad, but many learned it as well in the undergrad. And that they describe the costs that make a transaction happen, but they don't create value. So if you are a seller, you have to find somebody who buys your product. If you're a consumer, you need to, or a different firm, you need to find another firm that you can trade with. So you really are looking into trades. These days, you don't shake hands. So one reason, of course, not to shake hands is an epidemic, but another reason is that the transaction costs are too high. So, but it's a little bit abstract. So it's quite good to think of examples or a typology of what transaction costs are. And maybe the most famous typology of transaction costs is that there are 3 types of transaction costs. So first of all, you have to find another firm you want to trade with or you want to go into business with. So these would be search and information costs. Once you have found another firm, or when you're a consumer, once you have found a product that you want to buy, you need to evaluate how good that product is or how good that contract with them would be. And then you have to bargain and make decisions. So there's a little bit of bargaining going on. This is the second type of transaction costs usually mentioned. And then once you have come up with an agreement, you have to set up a contract, but then you have to make sure that the contract is enforced. And these would be policing and enforcement costs. So now we know a little bit better about what transaction costs are. So it's quite nice in this transaction cost literature that they do have this typology. It's easier to illustrate what transaction costs are when we have these examples. It's easier to categorize certain types of costs into search costs, which then makes it easy to identify similarities across domains. Oh yeah, in both domains where we thought that they are not related, but in both domains these are search costs. And it's also better to look for transaction costs once you have a typology like this. So that's quite a benefit. Also, Williamson, who was maybe the most popular researcher on transaction costs, he mentioned that transaction costs are the economic counterpart to frictions. And well, if sludge are excessive or unjustified frictions, then we thought, well, there's a big overlap. So let's do the research on this. Voila. So this paper asks now, do we need the concept of sludge when the well-established literature on transaction costs already exists? A sneak preview to this first question, the answer will be yes, because otherwise the paper would have been shorter. So we think we can identify some benefits of combining this and identify some similarities. So in the first part, which will be relatively short in this presentation, I'll talk about what the differences between sludge, or some differences between sludge and transaction costs are. And then the second part of the paper, which I think is the most important part, and which I think is the part that will be helpful as we go along, is to identify how the sludge literature can learn from transaction cost economics. Okay, so let's go to the first part. And the first difference that we found is about the origins or the determinants of what determines whether transaction costs or sludge are high or low. And in the new institutional economics literature, institutions are already quite often mentioned being the main determinant of transaction costs. So institutions would be the rules of the game. On a macro level, on a very big level, it is how society is organized, what laws we have, for example. And on a micro level, it could be smaller contracts that are going on. Could be formal institutions or informal institutions, like that we here ask the questions at the very end, would be an institutional rule that we have designed. So these would be rules of the game. In chess, it would be something like the bishop is allowed to go diagonally. The pawns have certain movements that they're allowed to do. The game is over when the king is taken, and so on. So institutions are the rules of the game, and they really determine whether transaction costs are high or low. So if the rules of the game make it really easy to trade and to make transactions, then these transaction costs are really low, but they can be making transaction costs really, really high as well. But this is slightly different from sludge. So there, the institutions don't really matter. What matters for sludge is the choice architecture. And there you see why I talked about the choice architecture at the beginning a bit when I introduced nudge, because the choice architecture is also the main determinant or the origin of sludge. And if institutions are the rules of the game, we can think of the choice architecture as the design of the game. So how is our world organized? In the chess example, it could be, is it an allowed or not so loud environment? In some chess boards, the king and the queen, they look quite similar. And all these design choices. For grandmasters, that doesn't matter. For grandmasters, they will be influenced by the rules of the game, definitely, that these are just the rules, and the design of the game might not matter too much for them. However, if you're relatively new to the game, or if you don't really know how to navigate through a choice architecture, then it might be more difficult to understand the game, play well, or navigate well through the choice architecture. So this is more relevant for people who are not experts. So there is the one similar difference that we found in terms of what are the main determinants of transaction costs. Well, these are the institutions, and the main determinants of sludge is the choice architecture. And we'll come back to this in a bit more. There are other differences and similarities that we identify in the paper. And the first one is that both literatures don't argue that people are always making rational decisions, like in many economics textbooks. Both literatures rely on the work by Herbert Simon on bounded rationality, so that people sometimes deviate from rational decision-making. But the sludge literature, which is based in the behavioral economics literature and behavioral science more broadly, goes a step further and does not only say that, yes, we deviate from rational behavior, but additionally, we can predict how we deviate from rational behavior. And that's the concept of predictable biases. So we know in certain situations, people will always underconsume or overconsume, but we know exactly whether it is under or overconsumption because it's a bias. It's not only noisy deviation from the rational benchmark. Then there are other similarities in terms of the consequences. In the transaction cost literature, people often talk about the main three E's: effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. And we looked into the emerging sludge literature. It's really just starting, so there's not too much on the sludge literature. That's why we want to contribute to it. But all the effects there can also be organized in terms of effectiveness. So do these transactions or do these actions really happen? So if you want to cancel a subscription, if you cannot do it, that's not very effective. In terms of efficiency, is how much time and effort do you have to spend to fill out a paper form, complete a form. So there's quite a lot of talk on wasted hours and wasted time in the sludge literature as well. But the main part in the sludge literature is certainly on equity. And that is this idea that the same choice architecture can be really harmful for some and maybe not for others. Moreover, sometimes the sludgiest choice architecture, the most problems are faced by the poorest in society. One example is the social security system. Filling out forms for the social security system can be really tough, can be very difficult to do. And the poor people often have poverty in their mind by definition. You know, they have to think of how to make ends meet. That means that their mind is often occupied with these financial thoughts. And that means that there are less resources available in the mind to fill out and complete these forms. Whereas if you have no troubles, no financial or otherwise other troubles in your mind, it might be relatively easy to complete the forms, to fill out the forms. So there's a big literature which is maybe growing the most in the sludge, on sludge, that sludge is particularly harmful for some cohorts of the population, which might be the poorer people, but might be rich, older people, might be people that don't speak the native language, and so on. So there's a lot on equity here. And now on the consequences, we can think of in the transaction cost literature, most of the time people talk about the lost money and the lost time. And then in many transaction cost studies, time is translated into money, often using the average annual wage. So if 5 hours are lost, then you multiply this by the wage, and then you have a time measure. And in the sludge literature, there's much more discussion on psychological costs as well. So filling out paperwork does not only take long time, might not only cost if you have to hire somebody else, but it also leads to stress and maybe shame in some instances and other psychologically negative effects. And the sludge literature focuses on that much more. Finally, there are typologies in the transaction costs literature, and I mentioned this first typology earlier on, search and information costs, bargaining and decision-making costs, policing and enforcement costs, but there are no typologies in the sludge literature, at least none that people have agreed upon or that people would use actively. So that was one of the bigger differences. Now that's all about the similarities and differences of part one of the paper I wanted to talk about, and now talk about 4 contributions that we can make for the literature on sludge based on the transaction cost literature. Now, the first contribution there is that we are looking in, we try to think about a new definition of what sludge is. And here's the definition that we suggest. Sludge describes aspects of the choice architecture that lead to the experience of excessive or unjustified costs. So I'd like to look into this definition in a wee bit more detail. Let's start with the one in purple, the choice architecture. So in our definition of sludge, we make it explicit that this is linked to the choice architecture and it's not linked to the institutions. So it would be the design of the game rather than what the rules of the game are. If there's a change of the rules of the game, it wouldn't be sludge anymore. So that limits the concept a little bit. There are behaviorally informed institutions, but that would not be sludge. You know, just like nudging is only a change of the choice architecture and not a change of incentives or reduction of the choices that people have, reduction of freedom of choice. Sludge also is only a change of the choice architecture. Now the next one is that it leads to the experience of excessive unjustified costs. So this point of experience really highlights that we put the individuals or the end consumers in the center. And it also highlights that if something is very creates costs for you, it might not create costs for me, and vice versa. So the same choice architecture can be easy to navigate in for some people, like the grandmasters. For them, the design of the game might not matter in chess, whereas the newbies and newcomers to chess, they might be influenced by this type of design of the game or the choice architecture. So that is really linked to this heterogeneity in terms of the effects of sludge. Now in green, we have the excessive or unjustified costs. And here there is a little definition in the literature on sludge. Sunstein has put out this definition that sludge is always excessive or unjustified, which then means that sludge reduction is always good, is always positive and welfare increasing. And Thaler would agree with that. But Sunstein in the next papers has changed his mind a little bit and now thinks that sludge can be for good. For example, you can think of when you want to buy a weapon in the US, you have to wait a day. That would be some sludge, or some decision points that you add somewhere and that reduce the amount of snacks that you have, so that you have multiple small bags, for example, rather than one big bag to reduce the snacking. But we stick here to this idea of sludge as something negative, because also in everyday life, would you think of sludge being connotated with a positive outcome? Maybe not. But we say here, okay, we define sludge as something that is negative, but we wouldn't, we don't want to defend this point really hard, but we just follow here the earlier Sunstein definition. And now the most important one in this definition, though, is on costs. So we really link sludge to the costs. So, and then these are specific costs, namely those that need to be paid to make an action happen, but that do not create any value. So, and if you recall what the definition of transaction costs was, that was very much similar. Transaction costs were the costs that need to be paid to make a transaction happen, but they don't create any value. So we really use the similar definition here, where costs can be transaction costs, but can be other costs as well. And the benefits of linking this sludge definition to costs is that we now can rely on other insights from the transaction cost literature and try to take over these other insights for our definition of sludge and how we work on sludge. And the first way we do this is by looking at a typology as well. So first of all, before that, I just wanted to highlight that this definition that we have here is very much in line with Sunstein's definition. It is not a new definition, it's just a little bit more specific. So he talks about excessive or unjustified friction. We talk about that as well. He talks about friction, and we talk about more specifically where this friction comes from, namely from the choice architecture. He has a subjective element there and what they wish. We talk about the experience. He talks about what makes it harder for people, and we there talk about a specific form of how it makes it harder for people, namely to increase some kind of costs. And about these costs, we talk about in the next section. And that next section is on the typology of sludge. So what we suggest is that we can look at the typology from the transaction cost literature, and then do something very similar and to create a typology of sludge. And this typology we can organize in terms of costs. So we suggest that sludges are aspects of the choice architecture that lead to the experience of search costs, evaluation costs, implementation costs, and psychological costs. The search costs are just the same as in the transaction cost literature, and for evaluation and implementation costs, we had to change the system a little bit. You can think of this in the sense of when you want to buy a product, you first have to search for the product, then you have to, once you found a product or multiple products, you have to evaluate the benefits and costs of these products. Then you can come up with a decision and decide whether you want to buy it or not, but then you have to implement that decision, and that's this three-step type of how many decisions these days happen. And psychological costs can happen at any point in time. Now, in terms of the definition, we would say that choice there's one definition of sludge being a choice architecture that makes it more difficult to acquire the relevant information about different options. So we can use the typology of costs in order to make it relatively easy to identify sludge. So right now you can just look, if you want to identify sludge, you can look for some choice architecture that makes it more difficult to find stuff. You can look for choice architecture that makes it more difficult to evaluate advantages and disadvantages. You can look for choice architecture that makes it more difficult to get what you want or to avoid what you do not want in case of unwanted subscriptions or something like this. And finally, you can look for choice architecture that creates negative experiences such as stress, stigma, disempowerment, or loss of autonomy and agency. There are many examples of these type of sludges, and some of the examples we had before already on one of the earlier slides with the many examples. And the benefits of this is that we can organize these examples now using this typology. This is not perfect. For example, hidden add-on costs, you know, when you buy a flight and then at the very last end, there are additional costs to the flight costs. That could be search costs, searching for the best flight, or could be implementation costs, or could be different types of costs, but it helps us very much to identify where sludge is. So it's really a good help for us to later on find sludge in everyday lives when we apply it to many contexts. So that's why we mainly like this typology of sludge. And we had a big list of all the sludges that are mentioned in the literature and that we could think of, and all of them somehow fit into this typology. So that works quite well so far. Now there's the third contribution of the paper, and that is on the factors that influence transaction costs. So maybe the most important factor that influences whether transaction costs are high or low is called asset specificity in the transaction cost literature. It essentially means that if you are a firm and you produce a good, and if you can trade this good only with one other firm, so it's extremely specific to trading with the other firm, then these are really high transaction costs for you to produce this, because the other firm can just tell you, well, I don't pay you what I wanted, what we decided I will pay you, I pay you less, and you cannot go somewhere else because what you produce is so specific to your certain transaction partner. So, and in the same way, we can think of the choice architecture of specificity. So you can think of when you are a teacher, for example, then you're an expert, for example, in Brightspace. And then you go to another university and they have a different type of learning environment where you have become an expert with the one, but that is not helpful at all anymore in the other learning environment. So it makes it quite difficult to navigate there. There's another aspect that increases transaction costs, and that is how uncertain the transactions is and how uncertain the transaction partners are. And in the same way, uncertainty can make things much more costly. So if the choice architecture makes it very difficult to evaluate how costly a product is, for example, that makes it more sludgy. And then finally, frequency. How often do people navigate through a choice architecture? So with the learning example, in my learning environment, I'm there almost every day right now. So I become quite proficient in that. But other things are not that frequent, such as tax returns once a year. So it only happens once a year, and many people are not experts in that. So that's why we need some consultants often to do our tax returns. So that makes it very sludgy. Yeah, so that's the third one. The fourth and final contribution that we make then in this paper is where we try to put everything together. So Sunstein has written another paper where he talks about the need and the benefits of so-called sludge audits. And sludge audits would be periodic look-backs at all the choice architecture in your government department, in your firm, in your personal life, wherever. And then he argues that it would be good to do these things to identify the sludge and then, where possible, reduce the sludge. But that's more or less it that we can learn from the paper that he wrote. Of course, there are more insights, but what we don't really learn from the paper is how to conduct these sludge audits. So what we want to do in this paper is we had our first three contributions, the definition, the typology, and the influencing factors. And we want to use these insights in order to help people to improve sludge audits, very much in an applied setting. And we have additional insights from the transaction cost literature on how transaction cost studies are conducted. And one of these insights is that often there is no data available in order to quantify how high transaction costs are. So what's often happening is that people engage in interviews and surveys in order to identify transaction costs. So most likely that will be the same for sludge audits, that if you want to identify where sludge is, you have to do interviews and surveys and maybe focus groups and these things. Maybe there's data available, but most of the time in the transaction cost literature, no data is available. Now, the second point is that in the transaction cost literature, you always look into exclusion and inclusion criteria for the people you talk to. And for sludge audits, it's really essential that you do talk to the people who have to navigate through the choice architecture, who have to go through the sludge. The reason for this is that if you talk to the chess grandmasters, they might not see that these effects of the design of the game are so big on newbies, on people who just started. So you really have to talk to the consumers or to the individuals who go through the choice architecture. And some others as well, but this is really the key, that there is an empathy gap often, you know, where you are an expert in your choice architecture, and you might, if you're a teacher, you feel this with your students as well. Sometimes you don't understand why they don't understand certain concepts, and why it's difficult for them to navigate through the bright space or something like this. So that's important. Now, once you have the interview set up and you have the right people, you need to identify what questions to ask. And for this, it's good to go use a two-step approach that they also use in the transaction cost literature. And the first step, you break up the process into many smaller required actions. So if you want to get rid of your Amazon Prime membership or something like this, can you reduce that into different actions? So the first action might be, okay, find out how to do it by watching a YouTube video. Next step is go to the website and so on. So really smaller actions. Of course, other bigger examples might be more important. But this is really helpful, because once you have broken up the process into smaller actions, then you can identify, for this particular action, what is the choice architecture? So you look into the choice architecture with a particular emphasis on different types of costs. Does the choice architecture make it more difficult or easier to find information? That means that would lead to search costs. Or does the choice architecture make it more difficult to evaluate the pros and cons of this action? So that would be a choice architecture that leads to evaluation costs. Does the choice architecture make it more difficult to implement the choices? And does the choice architecture lead to some psychological problems? So in that sense, the questions we can ask is, we use the definition that was really linked to the choice architecture, and we use the typology. So we ask where the typology leads to these different types of costs. And we can also look into frequency, uncertainty, and specificity. So is this choice architecture specific to this situation? Does it communicate things more or less certain or in uncertain ways? And how often are people engaged with this particular choice architecture? And these things will all determine how sludgy a process is then. And then the final point that we mentioned there is that there are maybe only two problems with sludge audits, and that is sludge and audits. So if you want to communicate to people that, look, you have this firm, maybe we do a sludge audit with you, they don't like the word sludge, at least in our experience, and they don't want to be audited. So there is a problem of talking to people and getting people motivated to engage in these sludge audits. Even if you have the best in mind, the best for the firm, best for the government in mind, these words and these things might lead people to be, might lead to some reactions that people don't really want to go there. Okay, so let me summarize the contribution that we made, and then do a small outlook on the next page. So in terms of the summary, part one of the paper is on the similarities and differences between the transaction cost literature and the literature on sludge. And then in part two of the paper, we suggest the definition. So sludge is the aspects of the choice architecture that lead to the experience of transaction costs or other types of costs. And then we have a typology that we suggested, these four types of costs: search costs, evaluation costs, implementation costs, and psychological costs. We talked about three different influencing factors that we know from the transaction cost literature: specificity, uncertainty, and frequency. And then we use these three steps, the definition, the typology, the influencing factors, in order to try to improve how sludge audits could be designed in the future. And in the future, what we want to do is we want to put some flesh to the bones. So we want to use this typology, which is really a good help to identify where sludge is happening. And that can happen in many domains. So you can think of I'm now working in environmental policy, so it can be, and if you talk to people, it is really hard to get grants to retrofit your house. And most of it is administrative burden. It's just annoying sludge. And there's a lot of implementation sludge. It's difficult to find the information about it. It's difficult to check whether it's worth it. So it really helps to think about these different typologies of sludges as well. Another area would be financial decision making, like setting up a new bank account in a country you're new to without proof of address, for example. It's extremely sludgy to do that. For finding the new health insurance, extremely sludgy to do that, because there's so much confusion. So it makes high evaluation costs. The choice architecture makes it difficult to evaluate it. Also in refugees, in direct provision centers, they're faced with a lot of sludge as well, where on paper they would be eligible for things, but then paperwork burdens are in the way. So there are really many areas where sludge is really relevant, and where we can think of applying this typology and the influencing factors and the definition. So the next step then is to measure welfare effects of sludges. So is sludge reduction always good? So we have to identify who is influenced by this, and then there's a big decision of whether we should reduce sludge at all. So there's a welfare question. This is not part of this paper, but some people have started to work on this. If sludge reduction is always good, well, then it might be definitely good to reduce sludge. But Sunstein, for example, argues that sometimes you need to make sure that systems work well, so that there's not too many people who take welfare benefits, although they are not eligible to take the welfare benefits. So in that sense, some administrative burden is needed. Whether you call it sludge or not is a question then. What for me is really nice is that, you know, I gave you so many examples there at the beginning of these things that annoy us in our everyday lives, but we don't have a language to talk about these things. So we just said, okay, here was something that's annoying, here's something that is annoying. But with this work on sludge, with the typologies and the definition, we see the communalities. We see that these things are essentially the same. So it really provides a language to help deal, at least psychologically in our heads, deal with these burdens. Just by knowing that there's a literature on this and that people are dealing with this, I had the feeling that sometimes it was even easier for me to navigate through sludge and do some paperwork things and say, oh, okay, I have to go through this. This is an interesting implementation cost that seems to be sludge that is related to that. So I think that's really a good benefit of this. As I said, this is a conceptual paper, and we hope to put a lot of data to this conceptual framework, but we think it will be helpful in the future on working on this. The paper is available in the Geary working paper series, so that should be quite easy to find if you have found this seminar as well. And that would be me.
Okay, thank you very much, Leo. I have two questions initially for you. The first question comes from Kevin Denny. Kevin is wondering, is sludge different from administrative burdens that people like Don Moynihan work on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's exactly the question that I discussed with Don Moynihan. And in fact, don't know. So I think he's working on a paper on exactly that, where he's looking into the differences. And he says, yes, they are different. For me, the main difference is that administrative burden is on what the name suggests, administration, and that is always a government-citizen interaction. And sludge is broader in the sense that much sludge is coming from firms, which was totally ignored by the public administration literature. There are a couple of other smaller differences, but if it was on me and with this paper, we really go into a very similar definition of sludge as what he suggests as well in the administrative burden literature. For example, one of the main improvements in that literature that Don made was that he specified 3 different types of costs: search costs, compliance costs, and psychological costs. And we thought about this as well, and sludge didn't fit the bill there, partially because compliance costs are always in relation to a hierarchical situation where you have to comply with the government as being a citizen. Whereas in sludge, sometimes you talk to firms and you don't want to comply with firms. You want to get out of a subscription, for example. But it is totally true that this literature is linked, and I'm talking to them, and there's a lovely special issue in the, I think it's the review of public administration review from last year, I believe, on behavioral public administration, where they talk about this and start talking about sludge as well. This is a literature that has started 2012 with a researcher called Burden. Now we want to rely on this as well, but talk more about sludge in the private sector, and potentially, because people like Sunstein and Thaler work on this, potentially that is a way for public administration researchers to be more policy relevant, because the people, nudge is already in the government in nudge units, and sludge might get in there as well, maybe easier than public administration. So there's a paper coming out from them on exactly that difference, and for me the main difference is that it's not only about government-citizen interactions.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer. Okay, I have a question from Philip O'Connell. So Philip wonders, do sludge and transaction cost approaches differ in how they deal with agency and actors? So for example, those who increases costs or creates frictions, and with intentionality. So why do actors increase cost or frictions?
Yes, intentionality, that's a big discussion in the literature on sludge as well. And so people are discussing whether sludge should always be intentional. I would put myself on the situation that it should not always be intentional, because sometimes sludge just emerges from a process. Like it could be a spontaneous order, or it could be that just over time different people have worked on different regulations and sludge is emerging, not as an intentional point of view, not as an intentional process that is happening. There was on Twitter, there was a long discussion on whether sludge should only be intentional, but I think most people would agree that it is not only intentional. And that's the same for transaction costs. Their intentionality almost plays no, well, I think in the literature, much less role. In the sludge literature, a little bit more. So I think intentionality is not we thought of having a chapter on intentionality indeed, but we thought there's not too much on transaction costs on intentionality. But the paper I just mentioned that I had a sneak preview to, that Don is writing with colleagues, they have a whole section on intentionality, and they discuss intentionality in context of sludge, administrative burden, red tape, and ordeal mechanisms. And these four different literatures, they treat intentionality differently. But we didn't have too much to say from the transaction cost literature. If you have good ideas of intentionality within the transaction cost literature, we'd be happy to integrate it. But so far, we couldn't really make something novel for the sludge literature out of it. If that answers.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have, unless anybody else wants to come in on questions and answers. Just one thing that struck me when you were talking about factors influencing sludge and the frequency with which people you have to navigate through choice architecture. You know, I was kind of thinking about kind of older age groups and so on, and you know, thinking at a more kind of practical level. I mean, how do we get to kind of making things easier for them if we, you know, if we're thinking about engaging with policymakers?
Yeah. So one thing is, I think what will happen is to rely on what we've learned in nudging. There are some frameworks. If you want to engage, encourage your behavior, make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. That's called an EAST framework: easy, attractive, social, and timely. So I guess making things easier is a key thing. Simplification is the most straightforward sludge reduction mechanism, most likely, especially when you don't have the handle of frequency. When in many situations, it doesn't make sense to make people go through the choice architecture, through the same paperwork more frequently. They might become better with it, but there's no use of that. So another way is on specificity there. If you could make it easier, so if the government has many forms and all the forms are more or less similar, that means that you learn how to go through this form once for the Department of Transport, then you also know how to go through the form for the Department of Health or something like this. So that would be one way to do it. And that might work in government interactions, but in the private sector, that would stifle innovation a little bit, you know, because different people do it differently and they find out better ways. So there is a discussion on that as well.
Okay, sure. So following on from that question, I have a question then from Orla Doyle. If some people find tasks, processes harder than others due to lower cognitive resources, should we aim to reduce the sludge or improve cognitive skills?
Should we, okay, and I think I read this one. Should we aim to reduce the sludge? Yes. Okay, that's obviously both. There is a lovely paper by Don Moynihan as well on 2020, just came out just now, on cognitive resources in public administration. They talk about a catch-22. The catch-22 is if you lack cognitive resources, partially because you're occupied when you thoughts with thinking of money, then you're also exactly the person who needs to go through the admin burden to get the Social Security. And now you're asking the question that is a little bit the same question that we also have in the nudge literature. Should we change the choice architecture to get people eat healthier, or should we educate people that a high carb diet might not be healthy? And the sensible answer is both. Some of the sludges say, look, we have tried information educating people for ages and it hasn't worked. Let's do changes of the choice architecture now. I think it's both. There's this concept of boosting in the behavioral literature as well. That means helping people to work with their heuristics. They don't call it biases, work with how they work. And one thing is of boosting would be to help people organize their choice architecture themselves. So that would be a way to combine both of them. Educate people so that they can nudge themselves or reduce the sludge in their lives. So you won't have me saying that I think only choice architecture interventions are better than education interventions. I don't believe that's true. Neither do I believe that only education interventions are good. I'm well educated, but I'm extremely lazy and influenced by the choice architecture in my everyday life all the time. So just ignoring, I don't think they should be in competition with each other. And there are complementarities if you teach people to organize their choice architecture.
Okay, thank you for that honesty. Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time. So Leo, I'd like to thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. And I think it's given us a guideline, a roadmap to look at the literature developments in the coming months and years ahead. And thank you very much for a really stimulating presentation today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot for the questions as well and listening. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.